All right, so I'll kick off. So thanks both for joining me this afternoon. It's really nice to see you both, and we're brought together to, I guess, to mark the 30th year of the Children of the 90s, which is a remarkable thing, really. Not just the tenure of the study and how long it's lasted, but all the stories and ups and downs that have gone with it. And we're talking about the study from our shared positions as principal investigators of the study. And I'm very much the newbie here, and I've only been in seat since about 2017, but brilliant to be, joined by you both, the original Jean, who set the study off and can tell us all about its history, and George, who came in midway through and looked after the study for many years. So that's, it's really exciting, and I don't think we've ever done this before. So Jean, go on. We should take it back, I guess, to the beginning of the study, and I guess hear about why you thought it was important to do this in the first place.
Well, I've been working on all sorts of large studies, and they had a limited amount of information, and I always got frustrated. You'd find an association and say, well, why is that? Why is low social class, for example, linked to X? And you couldn't get much further. So I had in mind that one needed a lot more data from way back. Amazingly, I was asked to plan a big study for the whole of Europe, which didn't take off properly. But that allowed me to think more clearly about what was needed. And it gave me the opportunity of going and talking to all sorts of experts in different fields. So there was an opportunity to do our own thing.
Where did you start though? Because so from my point of view, things are relatively well structured. I know who I'm supposed to go to speak to research and funding and that sort of thing. And the study's very much in place. But at that time, before any of that was there, were you just, was it obviously scientifically it wasn't guesswork, but in terms of the setting up bits, how did you start?
I'm glad it now looks very coherent. At the time, it was, well, the key thing was to try and persuade the funders, all sorts of funders, to subscribe to it. And I'd been talking to the MRC, the Medical Research Council, for a long time. And the person I was talking to was very positive and said she'd set up a meeting and invite all the key big funders in the country, and we could set out exactly what it was about and try and get them all to subscribe to a coherent, which sounded great.
Did they bite?
Well, unfortunately, her boss was there and obviously hadn't been briefed. So after we'd done all the presentations, he stood up and said, no way. He said, we're happy to have small grant applications for project grants, but no way are we going to commit to a big funding. So, that room was full of government departments and big charities and the Wellcome Trust. Wellcome Trust stood up and said they thought the government ought to. So we were sunk, really. It was a question of finding out what people would fund and make up projects that they would fund. So the biggest funders at that time was the Department of the Environment, who wanted to measure indoor air pollutants. And saw this as an opportunity.
Okay.
Which was interesting, but...
Yeah. And so that's what you're describing is much more piecemeal than I thought, you know, at the beginning, and really making it happen as it went along. Is that, and did that, were you worried about it, or were you just so filled with sort of enthusiasm and passion for it that you didn't mind?
Well, the great thing was the enthusiasm of everybody else. So once we'd got the plans, the media the local media, so the BBC and HTV,
yeah,
the local papers were running stories all the time. I trained myself to work incredibly hard and have 3 hours sleep a night.
Crumbs, okay.
We did nothing but write to people and try and drum up enough money to keep going. So my recollection was excitement and nail-biting tension.
Well, it's funny because that sensation is identical, and that I think that's certainly what consumes me into the late hours most evenings. And it's a funny blend, isn't it, of being excited yet terrified at the same time.
Yes.
And you know, in those early days, did you? I guess the other part of this story is the participants themselves, so the mums. And did you find that you got immediate engagement and folk wanted to be part of this story?
Yes, and that I think was absolutely amazing.
Yeah, yeah.
We advertised all over the place, and I can remember the very first day that we accepted people inquiring, pregnant mothers inquiring about children of the 90s. They had to post a postcard saying they would like more information. And I picked up the first one that dropped through the letterbox in our old office. And it was from a Mrs. Pilgrim. Now, to start a study, which is a sort of pilgrimage, and to have Mrs. Pilgrim there as the first person enrolling was amazing.
It's quite. How funny.
And the media seized on that and filmed her, and yeah, she had a lot of attention, quite rightly. Amazing.
So thinking back to that period then, was it completely mad to think that the study would be still going 30 years later and still going really strongly 30 years later?
Oh, I didn't think, I mean, I thought I was mad saying that we'd continue until the children were 7.
Really?
Yes.
Wow.
Well, in those early years, you remember, you know, we enrolled over a 21-month period, pregnant mothers, and so the very important times of the child's life were during the pregnancies and the first year or 2 of life. So we collected an enormous amount of information from the parents, had quantities of questionnaires, and were wonderful at filling them in. But all of that cost money, and we had a terrible point where I could see we were going into the red, whatever we did. And there was the question as to whether the university, who employed us all, would close the whole study down. Unfortunately, the vice-chancellor at that time, who was the head of the university, knew about epidemiology and genetics and decided this was worth investing in.
So before you move forward, Nick, I can confess I saw a little note that that was in the back of the Lancet saying, you know, that Jean Golding was setting up a birth cohort. And in that little piece, Jean, my memory is you didn't emphasize that it was just about pregnancy and childbirth. It sort of hinted that, well, it sort of suggested that this would be interesting, you know, there'd be ideas of looking at how these things affected later health. And just thought, well, that's, you know, that's like, you know, firstly, it's a rather ambitious and that it would collect, biological samples, because the previous birth cohorts hadn't done that, antenatal samples, etc. That was incredible addition. And just thinking it was just, not going to happen, and impossibly ambitious to think you could set something up which would actually allow you to look at adults and do it now. And that, in any case, I'd be dead before they'd be adults.
So George, the anecdote is that you did think it was bonkers at the time, and it was way too ambitious. So you then ended up becoming heavily involved in it and a PI of a study that you thought was complicated. I mean, what was the plan?
Well, the immediate plan was just to ensure funding, essentially, because it was to continue funding, because it was even I had realised that this was going to be extraordinarily valuable, and that there were many things that you can't get retrospectively.
So 10 years into the running of the study, then you're working on it as a researcher and helping to write grants to do research on it. And how does that then, Jean, transition to thinking, hang on, there's an opportunity for succession and moving on and so on?
Well, I had, because age 65 was approaching, the deadline for my retirement was coming up. The study had a really good reputation by then, particularly in the States, where they just thought they couldn't do it and we were the bee's knees. A lot of discussion which I was involved in, but fortunately George emerged as the director to be. At least that's my view of it, George.
Yeah, I think there was a bit of arm twisting
yes.
behind the scenes.
And George, did you have any, was there an aspiration? I know you say you came in thinking about, keeping the study going and keeping the funding going, which is critical. But did you think this is actually an opportunity to do something?
No, I mean, I thought it was as it is. It was a unique resource and opportunity for being able to study processes that data simply hadn't existed before, to be able for that to be able to be done. I guess, I mean, beyond just keeping the study going and funding is obvious anxiety. The two things I was very sort of passionate about was firstly sort of data accessibility. I'd written an editorial in the BMJ in 1994 when it wasn't fashionable.
And George, your time is also saw some pretty major changes to the type of research that we do. So, genetics sort of exploded and other stuff happened.
So that was the thing was the samples had all been Jean and Marcus Pembrey and in particular together with had gathered all the samples, and they could have been genotyped at a stage when no one else had that sort of size of population. With that intensity of phenotyping genotype, there was this.
So George, just for those listening, I guess. So what we're talking about is that quite often we see in the media, don't we now, that genetics is related to things, health and well-being, and actually what you're saying is that children of the 90s had the capacity to do that from a very early stage, and one of the things you had to really fight for on the legacy that Jean left was the ability to do that.
Yeah,
but I think the study at that point was extraordinarily well placed to make use of a real technological revolution that happened in the mid-2000s. So, and I think this is a bit of a recurrent theme, isn't it, Jean, that actually all the legwork in the past has now repeatedly left children of the 90s in a position to pounce on new studies and ready to go, hasn't it?
And be way ahead of the field.
Yes, right. Why don't we do a round robin whereby we both think of one, maybe two standout studies or contributions that you think the study has made?
Well, there are so many. Nowadays, I think one of the most important features that children of the 90s can look at is health. Mental health is so important and becoming increasingly important. And we can compare across the generations. So I think there's a lot that children of the 90s can do to show just what factors are responsible for the increasing depression rates.
Absolutely, and I often think about the work of some of our collaborators looking at seemingly simple things like maternal experiences with mental health, but and that's something which is changing all the time. But a study like Children of the 90s can look at the same things 30 years apart and then start to unpick what's going on, and the finding that we've seen, that the suggestion of changing mental health patterns across those eras, which has come from Children of the 90s, I think is a real standout one.
Yeah, I agree.
George, have you got any good examples?
The children, when they were aged around 5, and then again 6.5 or 6, had been given basically a page to draw on, but all were being trained to answer questions. And there was a question saying, "Do you enjoy school?" Yes, no on first time, and then yes. Yes, a lot. Yes, a bit. No, and I thought that's very, really interesting potential indicator of how people's trajectories and got those entered, and the interest and they then have been related to education on social trajectories, and it turns out that how a child says they're actually enjoying school at age 5 and 6 relates to their educational outcomes, and most interestingly is not strongly socially patterned, but is still a strong predictor of educational outcomes, and also gives a possible way of thinking about something that one should look for, is that that lack of enjoyment is something that you can, in principle, think about ways of trying to alter that.
What about yours, Nick?
Well, so I have the luxury now of being presented with all these findings across the study almost every day, and we see things on standards for clinical activity around liver health and mental health and so on. But personally, one of my favorites, I think, was probably the second ever paper I wrote with Children of the 90s data. And I was contacted by a friend actually, who is at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig. And he was working on a response to a paper, a really controversial paper that had been published about mutations in a gene which had been correlated with cognitive function and a series of other wacky things like microcephaly, so having an abnormally small brain volume. And the reason this was controversial was that those mutations were really highly correlated with where you come from in the world, and the frequencies were different country by country. So the implication of carriage of these mutations, not just that they're related to cognitive function, but that then related to your ethnicity, was clearly, really fiery. And we were contacted to look right across all the data that Children of the 90s have and say, look, are those mutations really doing anything that would make us believe that that type of evolutionary event could happen? And this is probably one of the only times this has ever happened to me. We wrote a response showing a null effect across all of our SPAC data, no evidence of selection. And it was tiny. It's a one-pager that went into the journal Science. And I received, I think, 3 comments back from reviewers saying this has to be published. And it just destroyed that debate immediately. And it was just such an amazing illustration of, if you got the right data ready to go, you can write something really inceptive and useful. And it was, to this day, it's one of the really nice moments of clarity that you get from decent data, but really exciting. And of course, for me at that stage, I think I was still in the midst of my PhD, and to have something like that where you could make a contribution to a field was just enormously exciting. Yeah, probably kept me in the business. I don't know, but it was really exciting. So look, I think we should probably start wrapping up, but I think we need to have a view to the future. So we talked about the history of the study, all the sorts of trials and tribulations over 30 years, but I'd like to get your feelings about the future of the study, and then maybe I can give you a couple of reflections on where I think things are going. But Jean, where do you want the study to go? What do you want to see from it going over the next 30 years?
Well, I've got more and more interested in epigenetics and the way in which markers of your environment get transferred down the generations. And as many of our parents will know, we ask them for their family histories going back to their great-grandparents or the children's great-grandparents. And there's a lot of fascinating information there, I think is going to be incredibly important in trying to sort out what may or may not be happening in plants and in animals. But there's very little information on humans at the moment.
Certainly, yeah. It was really interesting. So multiple generations and different ways and different things that could affect health and well-being, I guess. That's really interesting. George, what about you?
Yeah, so I'm interested in social transitions. I think the education data and that Alsbach has obtained through record linkage, etc., is incredible. Is an incredible resource, and then looking at those across generations as the next generation is being collected, and an absolutely key thing is the children of the 90s and building that as as a way of looking at across generations and how things are transmitted socially across generations, as well as this biological transmission.
Yeah, really interesting. And I guess if I were to gaze forward, I think for me, because I guess I'm in the box seat at the moment, visibility and access to the resource is just fundamental, and it's interesting that so I sort of finish up there, and both of you have mentioned that throughout, that actually all the time and effort and work that's gone into it, and the data and the samples that are there, really making them available and visible to not just researchers, but all of those people who need them, whether it's people who do policy and government stuff, or whether it's people who do research. That's just fundamental. But I think from a research point of view, one thing which has changed radically over even the last year, and Children of the 90s has had a major contribution to, is this interplay between what we see as administrative data, so the sort of, if you like, the data trail everybody leaves behind them, and then studies like Children of the 90s. And one of the fallouts of this terrible pandemic period that we've been in is that really getting hold of administrative data, so healthcare data for the entire nation, is now a reality. And in that context, the big question for me is then, what would a study like Children of the 90s offer to make that, the understanding of those types of really big data sets, better? So are we this concentrated zoom in the telescope to allow a detailed, dissection of those mega data sets, and to allow, good healthcare results and social care results to be derived? I think that's very exciting for the future of the study. But yeah, look, this has been really, really fun. It's been exciting. I hope you've got something out of it too, thinking back on all those memories and all those years. I think I've certainly aged more than the 3 or 4 or 5 years that I've been involved in leading the study, and having done research on it for 15 years, I just feel very fortunate to be in this position. But thanks, Jean. What an amazing thing to kick off, and what an amazing contribution you've put in and still do. I should say that you're in the 30th year of the study. You've brought in some of the most rich and brilliant opportunities funding-wise in the last year, no less.
Yes.
Which is really fantastic.
Who would have thought?
which is amazing. So we'll keep you close, Jean. Keep you working on the study. Retirement is not an option.
So I'm looking forward to the possibility of an in-person 30th birthday party.
Yeah,
Nick,
wouldn't that be good?
That's your responsibility to organise
Okay,
the
we can sort that out.
and to get the warm the traditional Bristol warm Chardonnay available.
Yeah, and George, thanks very much. You know, obviously an amazing contribution in the midst of the study, and to take over from the study started so well and carried on so brilliantly is a good position for me. But yeah, thanks both, and yeah, I think that's it.
Thank you for taking it forward.
Absolutely.
Pleasure, absolute pleasure.